who will give us their 596A peer review. And first up is Chris Harris. So Chris, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dr. Kessler. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to watch my talk today. My name is Chris, and today I'll be proposing an exploratory spatial analysis for safe wildlife passage in southwestern Montana. So the broad overview of my presentation is as follows. I'll introduce you to the issue of wildlife vehicle collisions and some of the previous work that has been implemented to mitigate those collisions. I will also provide an overview of my specific study area, some of my methods, and then finally outline some of my expected results. So each of these sections is color-coded so y'all can more easily follow along. And at the end, there will be time where I can answer any questions. So I'll start by painting a broad ecological picture for you. Over the past several decades, wildlife in the western United States have experienced habitat fragmentation due to human development. Simply put, we have built our homes and roads in areas where wildlife have historically lived and found their food. This is just a simple example of the progression of a small subdivision south of Missoula, the town where I grew up in western Montana. When we build structures like roads through wildlife habitat, it leaves less space as well as creates barriers for animals who historically need to access all sorts of different pieces of their habitat. So here's just a simple example of how a road through wildlife habitat, which is displayed by this green polygon, can create a barrier to travel. Ultimately, the increased overlap of humans and wildlife has led to an increase in wildlife vehicle collisions. The picture on the left illustrates the danger that wildlife face when crossing highways in western Montana. And of particular concern are large ungulates such as elk, pictured on the right, whose large body size can cause serious vehicular damage and also bodily injury to the motorist. The coyote in the picture on the left luckily made it unscathed. The vehicle you see and the one we were in luckily saw it. However, here is an example of a vehicle that struck and killed an elk and actually rolled due to the impact. They hit an elk on one of western Montana's highways. The driver of this vehicle luckily escaped mostly unharmed. But this is a great example of the danger that these animals pose to motorists as they're traveling through Montana. Over the past couple of decades, the Montana Department of Transportation and the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks have acknowledged the danger that wildlife vehicle collisions pose to motorists, and they have also installed wildlife crossing structures to mitigate those collisions and also increase habitat connectivity. Wildlife crossing structures are often accompanied by long stretches of wildlife exclusion fencing to keep wildlife off the highway and more or less direct them to use these crossing structures. These crossing structures and fencing are really expensive to install. And in order to decide where to place such a structure, we must first understand how animals are moving throughout their habitat and where they're deciding to cross our highways. This ensures that when we place a structure somewhere, that wildlife will actually use it. This particular structure is built across US Highway 93, and it's located on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes land. And the sign you see here is appropriately labeled Animals Bridge in Salish. So the previous overpass I showed you was actually one of 41 fish and wildlife crossing structures that were installed across US 93. And the majority of these crossing structures were actually underpasses like these two in the pictures that I'm showing. Monitoring efforts of the Highway 93 structures between 2010 and 2015 documented wildlife using the structures over 95,000 times, which is 95,000 times that wildlife and motorists could have collided. A similar post-construction study concluded that crossing structures in combination with wildlife exclusion fencing can reduce wildlife vehicle collisions 70 to 80%. So the takeaway here is that these structures have been proven to be successful, especially if they're properly placed so that animals can utilize them. So narrowing our focus a bit, one particular area of concern for vehicle collisions is in southwestern Montana. So the town of Bozeman in particular has seen sustained human population growth over the past decade, and the residents of Bozeman utilize the 3 highways that I've displayed here to enjoy a variety of outdoor recreational activities, visiting Yellowstone National Park being one of the big attractions. This increase in human population has led to an increase in traffic on these roads as well, and that's caught the attention of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the Department of Transportation. They've recognized the need or the potential need for crossing structures in this area, and they have implemented previous studies to look into whether crossing structures are an appropriate mitigation strategy for wildlife vehicle collisions. And in particular, US Highway 287 was the subject of one such study. So a variety of methods were utilized to document wildlife crossings along US Highway 287, including live observations, track observations, camera traps, carcass counts, and also wildlife GPS colors like the one visible on this cow elk here. All the methods allowed the researchers to identify stretches of 287 where wildlife appeared to be crossing pretty regularly. Here are two example figures from the Highway 287 study. I apologize for the poor quality. All the available PDFs, which I used to take screenshots, had very poor resolution. However, on the left, you can see how the researchers identified different stretches of the highway based on the number of carcasses observed and their severity. And on the right, you can see different travel paths of a few elk individuals based on their GPS collars that was collected by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And in this figure, the researchers displayed several hotspots of animal crossings as well as observed carcasses. Here's a blown up section of the map. Again, apologize for the poor quality. But at the end of the report, the authors did not recommend any particular area to install wildlife crossings along 287, but they did highlight areas that had potential. And this is just one of the studies that have been conducted to determine if the crossing structures are appropriate mitigation strategy. Similar studies, however, have not been performed for US Highway 89, which you can see here travels roughly north-south from Livingston to Gardner, Montana. Therefore, I chose the Highway 89 corridor as my area of interest for my capstone project. My study area is outlined in red, and it's roughly 1,500 square miles, and it encompasses the entire Highway 89 corridor from Livingston to Gardner. It's important to consider if wildlife crossing structures are appropriate for the Highway 89 corridor because it's a highly traveled route for visitors of Yellowstone National Park. The route displayed here is a very common route for visitors trying to access Yellowstone from the northern entrance. And in 2019 alone, close to 800,000 visitors used this route to access the park. In addition, it's the only route that you can use to access Yellowstone with your own personal vehicle in the winter months, which also is when many ungulates like elk are living at lower elevations close to where we as humans are building our highways. Elk travel to lower elevations in the winter due to high snow loads in the mountains and more easily accessible food down low. This is backed up by ecological literature as well as some of the preliminary investigations that I've performed on my data. Which brings me to my research questions. For my capstone project, I primarily want to know where in my study area are potential locations for a wildlife crossing structure or multiple structures. And in order to answer that question, I first need to understand how elk are moving throughout the study area over time, paying careful attention to their proximity to Highway 89. And I also want to know what land cover types elk prefer within the study area. I've obtained a variety of data sources in order to answer those questions, and they include point data that will help me understand where elk crossing Highway 89 as well as being hit. And in addition, I've obtained aerial imagery and imagery-derived products that will help me answer the question of what land cover types elk prefer. So I'll quickly go through a couple visual examples of the data that I'll be using. This first data visualization is of the elk data that I received from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The pane on the left displays what the elk GPS locations look like when they're plotted. And each data point here represents one individual elk from a particular herd at one point in time. And these points are collected at regular intervals so you can essentially track the individual's location over time. And just as a quick note, although each data point only represents one individual elk, it can be used as a proxy for the entire elk herd since they typically hang out together. The second pane here displays the general movement path of that individual elk, which is simply created by connecting the dots, connecting the points. One can easily see each time the elk crosses a highway, in my case, Highway 89, by identifying where the travel path just crosses the highway. And as a side note, the original data set that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks allowed me to access had over 3 million data points. So there was a fair amount of data cleaning to perform in order to narrow down my data set. But after all was said and done, I was left with 161 individual elk from 5 different herds with points that fall within my study area. And lastly, the pane on the right here is what the wildlife carcass data from Montana Department of Transportation and the Highway Patrol looks like. The original data sets that I received from both those agencies were just a collection of all observed carcass roadkill locations for a variety of different species along Montana highways. And I narrowed it down to just display elk for one, and elk that were hit and killed within my study area. So I've already explored these data and they have yielded some important information. In particular, they have helped me understand where elk are moving throughout the Highway 89 corridor. And the general summary is this. I've found that the majority of elk crossings are occurring throughout the winter months when they're hanging out at lower elevations, which, like I previously mentioned, is where we have built our highway. And while these points do help me understand where elk are, it doesn't really help me understand why they're choosing to cross the highway back and forth. So in an effort to better understand why they're crossing in the winter months, I want to perform habitat selection analysis. And this is something that wildlife biologists commonly do to better understand what habitat types wildlife are selecting for. And this is simply done by dividing a landscape up into different land classes, plotting the observational data, which in my case is the elk GPS locations, and seeing how those data are distributed between each class, see how many points are lying within each land cover class. So here's an example of a couple different land cover classes or habitat types that an elk can select for. There's a nice mix of native grasslands, forest stands, water and agriculture throughout this image. This is NAPE aerial imagery that I've obtained, and it's centered over Highway 89 in my study area. The reason I believe a habitat selection analysis will allow me to understand why elk are crossing the highway is because elk will presumably be traveling between these highly preferred classes or land cover classes. And if those classes exist on opposite sides of the highway, then they'll need to cross the highway at some point. So here's that same image just displayed in a color infrared band combination. And as you can see, healthy vegetation that's found in the agricultural fields appears as a reddish pink. Now imagine that the elk were preferring this agriculture class over other classes. Then eventually they would need to cross Highway 89 as they move from field to field. So again, here we have a simple aerial image, again, centered over Highway 89, outlined in red for your convenience. And you can see a mix of land cover or habitat types like agriculture, forest stands, and grasslands. Here's a very general idea of what a land cover classification would look like. I'll be using eCognition Developer to perform a supervised object-based classification. And for this example, the imagery on the previous slide has been divided up into 5 different land classes, which you can see in the top right-hand corner. The next step in the habitat selection analysis would be to plot a random set of points throughout my study area. If elk were selecting for each land cover class without preference, this is the type of point pattern that we would expect to see. So in other words, these points represent what is available to an elk throughout a study area, assuming that they have the ability to travel anywhere within that study area. And as you can see here, they're pretty nimble, so that assumption is fairly accurate. The next step is to plot observed data, which again, in my case, is the GPS location data. And I can run a selection on both the random and observed points to determine how many points are within each land cover class. So without crunching any numbers, you can immediately observe here that there are more points from the more observed points in the agriculture class than random. So it appears that elk are selecting for agriculture. And just as a side note, I've made up all these points. This is just for this example. None of this is based on real data. So the true habitat preference metric comes from when you compare the random to the observed points in each land class, just like we did for the agriculture in the previous slide. So again, look at the agriculture class here, for example. Out of 100 random points, 25 of them were within the agriculture class. But out of 100 observed points, 50 of them were in the agriculture class. So in other words, elk in this example are 2 times more likely to select for agriculture compared to random. And with this information in mind, you can then rank each land cover class from least to most selected for. So this answers the question of which land cover class they are preferring, but next I want to know how to connect those areas. The rank information can be used to create a cost raster of sorts, which can in turn be used in a cost connectivity analysis. So you can see how each land cover class here has been assigned its rank according to the habitat selectivity analysis from the previous slide. Here is a more realistic example of what a habitat preference cost raster looks like. The most preferred areas in this image are displayed in dark green, while the least preferred areas are displayed in orange. And the cost connectivity analysis that I will run simply links the most preferred areas using a least cost path throughout my study area. So in my case, wherever a least cost path crosses a US Highway 89, that'll be a strong potential location for a crossing structure in my mind. And in this example, you can see a least cost path crosses a highway near the center of the image. So once I've located potential locations for these crossing structures with my least cost paths, I'll then compare them to the carcass and the crossing data to see if they occur in the same areas. Because if they do, in my mind, that is even more evidence that this would be a suitable location for a crossing structure. So in summary, my expected results are to classify land cover and create a map with elk preference identified. I also want to identify sections of Highway 89 that elk are regularly crossing. And ultimately, I want to identify potential locations for wildlife crossing structures throughout my study area. Here's a basic timeline of events leading up to my completion of 596B in fall 2. And the goal here is to have all my data gathered and processed within the next couple months. And once that is complete, I can perform my analyses, write up my results, and hopefully present my findings at a virtual conference this fall. So with that, thank you for watching, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, Chris, great job. Great job. We'll wait for, you have a question already in the chat. So if you could please read the question and then respond, that'd be great.
Sounds great. Pulling it up now. Okay, the question is, do you know if hunting pressure, assuming it is permitted, has any influence on elk movement patterns in your study area? So there are a lot of different pressures on elk in this study area for sure. And I'm sure that hunting does play a part. In addition to that, it's been proven, especially in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that predator pressure like wolves has caused elk to alter their behaviors. As to what that specific behavior is, I can't answer that, but yes, that there is an element of that. And ultimately what I'm looking to do is provide a very general idea of, crossing patterns and identify areas that could be of interest, and take that to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, as well as the Department of Transportation. And it'll be used as one piece of the puzzle in determining if and where a crossing structure is available. But yes, that's a great question. I have another one from Greg. He says, very interesting. Did you consider geographic characteristics such as rivers, streams, valleys, hills, etc., for preferred travel routes of elk? Yes. So I didn't really include it in this presentation because I felt like it would bog down things a little bit. But once I create my cost raster based on their preference, if I just use that alone, it would basically just be saying, I want to place the structure where it's difficult to say that it's a cost raster, because instead it's where they're preferring to go. So my cost raster, I want to combine with a DEM. So just do simple map algebra. And so my end cost raster will be a preference overlaid with like the steepness, the slope essentially of the surrounding terrain. So hopefully give them the easiest path and the most preferred path from point A to point B of preferred areas. Got another one, says, fascinating project. I wonder how transportation planners make site selections for wildlife passages without the benefits of spatial analysis. That's a good question. I don't know. I can't really speak to that because I'm not inside the mind of one of them, but I know that at least the crossing structures that I've presented and that were built in Montana have all had some element of spatial analysis baked into them. It's becoming more and more common. That initial overpass that I showed you at Highway 93, it was a fairly obvious one to them because it was a location where a lot of animals were being hit. So it was sort of a spatial analysis without actually performing a spatial analysis in a GIS, I think. Other Department of Transportations like Nevada in particular, there's a great video. I believe it's called Reconnecting the Wild. They did the same kind of thing that I'm doing, where they hooked up a bunch of mule deer with GPS collars, and that was pretty much their sole determination on where to place one of those things. So, yeah. What is the cost of a crossing structure, bridge or underpass? It's in the 93 one was in the millions. And I wish I could tell you more concrete number, but it's expensive. Yeah, it's just like regular other construction. They got to close down the highways, and yeah, expensive. From Tim, says, to validate your findings, do you plan to then also run your analysis on the other highway corridors that have crossings to see if they align with the least cost path approach you're proposing in your study? It's interesting, and I have thought about sort of cross-validating my findings for sure. I'll have to get back to you on that. I think what would happen is I would have to find pre and post data, because ultimately when you have post-construction data, they're going to be using that crossing structure. So it depends on the availability of the pre-construction, like GPS data, I think.
All right, well, great job, Chris. Lots of good questions. So let's transition here. Andrew Hicks is up next with his presentation. So Andrew, start sharing your screen. There we go. All right, we can see your presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I know it's getting pretty late, especially on the East Coast. I'm in Colorado, so it's still a decent afternoon where I'm from. As you can see on the slide, my name is Andrew Hicks, and for my capstone proposal, I will be discussing how I plan to leverage multiple GIS tools to empower local planners to better prepare for and prevent wildfires. This is just an overview of what I plan to cover today. I'm going to start off with a background of wildfire situation here in Colorado. I want to discuss some key terms to define my study area, go over my goals and objectives for this project, discuss my methodology, highlight some anticipated results, and then talk about my timeline, discuss presentation values, and go over a few of my references. All right, let's do it. So along with everything else that happened in 2020, Colorado, along with the rest of the US, had a wildfire season that was exceptionally catastrophic. More than 625 acres burned across Colorado alone, and the top three highest records for wildfires were broken in just 1 year. This devastation has forced planners in Colorado to shift focus from a reactionary approach to a precautionary one, where preventative measures are the primary focus. This shift was noticeable in Colorado's recent 2021 budget proposal, which recommended $78 million for preventing and managing wildfires, which is a huge increase from the $16.5 million that was allocated the previous year in 2020. This increased focus, along with a huge boost in funding, has led to a concerted push for wildfire protection planning, and counties across Colorado have made a refreshed push to update dated community wildfire protection plans, or CWPPs. So to take a step in and discuss or at least explain what a community wildfire protection plan is. A community wildfire protection plan was first outlined in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act in 2003 in order to provide land management agencies and communities flexible guidelines to help them identify risk and prioritize mitigation actions. The HFRA encouraged local communities to engage in comprehensive forest wildfire management planning and public land management agencies to consider the community's recommendations as they develop strategic forest management plans. For Colorado specifically, the Colorado Senate Bill 09-001 passed by the Colorado General Assembly mandated that a CWPP be completed and approved for each county. A CWPP in general terms, is intended to be a community-based plan that provides a wildfire hazard and risk assessment for neighborhoods and subdivisions identified within wildland urban interface zones within counties and fire protection districts, and is intended to make recommendations for specific actions to reduce wildfire hazard and to individual structures and communities as a whole. So I mentioned it before, what is a wildland urban interface? A wildland urban interface is defined as an area where human development meets and intermingles with undeveloped wildland, and it is the zone where the largest insured losses from wildfire in the United States have occurred. Typically, the WUI is classified as wildland fuels in close proximity to structures and may include topographic influence. Areas covered in the WUI can include interface areas where neighborhoods are directly adjacent to open spaces, intermix areas, homes interspaced with natural fuels, or occluded interface areas where neighborhoods are isolated or surrounded by areas of natural fuels. Approximately 1/3 of US homes are in what can be zoned as WUI in the US, with an estimated of 4,000 acres per day being converted from wildland into WI through residential development. FEMA recently estimated that several 100,000 businesses are estimated, and an estimated population of more than 120 million people are also located within WI zones in just the US alone. So the point I want to hit home with this is, so when you think of WUIs, don't think of it just cabins surrounded by trees. WUIs can very well include suburban neighborhoods that are influenced by adjacency to hazardous areas. So for my study area that I want to focus on for this project will be Fremont County in South Central Colorado. Fremont County is a predominantly rural county that is about an hour and a half drive south of Colorado Springs. As of 2020, the population of the county sits around 47,000, with two main population centers in Canyon City and in Florence. A majority of the land mass of the county is in public ownership, with federal lands within the county consisting primarily of Bureau of Land Management land and contained within the San Isabel National Forest lands located in the San Francisco Mountains. Over the last 10 years, Fremont County has experienced rapid growth, and most of that growth has occurred within wildland urban interface areas that was identified in 2007 when the county first published their first CWPP. So to take a step back, you may be wondering why I chose Fremont County. Well, earlier this year when I started this project, I reached out to the forest manager for the Bureau of Land Management office here in Colorado just to inquire about the status of current fuel treatment practices. During our conversation, the manager recommended that I should reach out to Fremont County because they were in the initial phases of starting to update their CWP that they hadn't updated since 2007, but had a lack of GIS support due to personnel losses. I reached out a few days later to the Emergency Management Department at Fremont County and met their planning team a few days later and offered my support. And that was quickly welcomed, and I was quickly brought on board and integrated into their planning process as they started to update their CWPP. So after talking with the planners of Fremont County, they intend to use the following framework and steps to update their CWPP. These steps were pulled from a handbook that was created out of a collaboration of city and forest planners back in the early 2000s to provide communities with a guideline to build their respective plans. This process kicks off at step one when the team is built out of representatives from the appropriate local governments, local fire authorities, state agencies, and that are responsible for direct city planning and forest management. As they move into step two, that team that was identified is going to work to identify and engage local representatives that play a role in the local land management, like the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. As I mentioned earlier, a large portion of the community shares boundaries with federal and public land. So it is essential during this step to bring in representatives from those agencies so that they can focus on joint areas of concern near areas that have population density. So as they move into step 3 is where the planners intend to contact and encourage active involvement in plan development from a broad range of interested organizations and stakeholders. A broad range of stakeholders could be impacted by this plan to include everything from homeowners associations to environmental conservation groups that have a role in or can be impacted by the mitigation measures recommended by the final plan in the CWPP. So moving into step 4, at this point, the planners, including myself at this point, plan to work with partners to establish a baseline map of the community that works to define the community's wildland urban interface and displays inhabited areas at risk, forward areas that contain critical human infrastructure, and forest areas at risk for large-scale fire disturbance. Using the map that was created in step 4, the county planners will use that as a guide when we try to develop a community risk assessment that considers fuel hazards, risk of wildfire occurrence, homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure at risk, and other communities and values at risk, and local preparedness capability. Using both of those products, the county planners would then use those products to facilitate collaborative community discussion that leads to the identification of local priorities of fuel treatment, reducing structural inhabitability, and other issues of interest, such as improving fire response capability. Using those results, the planners will then work with respective partners to build a detailed implementation strategy to accompany the CWPP, as well as a monitoring plan to ensure its long-term success. And finally, during the final step, we plan to finalize the CWPP and communicate the results to the community and key partners. So, as I mentioned before, after conferring with the county planners, we determined that I would take a lead on steps 4 and 5 in a direct support role, and then provide an advise and assist role in steps 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so I mentioned before, so my primary goals to accomplish those steps for this project is to utilize GIS to identify areas within the wildland urban interface in Fremont County communities that are at a higher risk for wildfires, so that community leaders can better prioritize mitigation and prevention efforts. So looking at the steps that I discussed before, I see steps 4 and 5 of the CWP checklist as a way to answer 2 key questions that I tend to address. Where is the problem, and how does the problem vary spatially between different communities of Fremont County? I intend to answer those questions by creating a county-wide base map that identifies populated areas, transportation corridors, and critical human infrastructure, which comprise of utilities, schools, and et cetera, in proximity to the WUI that would be a critical considerations for wildfire mitigation planning. After completing the base map and communicating the results to the county planning team, I plan to analyze each at-risk community by using a GIS-based risk index model that rank orders each community using a relative risk assessment ranging from low to extreme. A few of the risk factors that I plan to consider include structural characteristics of the communities, such as roofing, siding, decks, fuel types in the area, slope of the terrain, aspect of the terrain, housing density in the community, and any other factors that can influence fire behavior and structure inhabitability. I also plan to consider wildfire history in the area and factor in a level of risk that considers where fires have occurred in the past and what the fire return interval is. My overall intent and goal for the products that I create here is for the categorized risk map to be used in the final CWPP to demonstrate wildfire risk to residents in a graphical manner for planners in each community. So as I mentioned before, the methodology for my analysis is going to revolve around identifying and classifying criteria that are key contributing factors to wildfire risk within the WI. These variables will be then compiled into a risk classification model as a means to assess predominant characteristics within individual neighborhood communities as they relate to structural inhabitability, fuels, topography, expected fuel behavior, emergency response capability, and ultimately human safety and welfare. For data sources, I plan to heavily leverage existing fire behavior models and the land fire database to analyze existing ground and canopy fuels in the area. And I plan to lean heavily on local agency support for data on historic fire activity in the area, structural characteristics, and emergency response capabilities. I stated my goals and objectives. My anticipated results for this project include a baseline map of the county and communities that defines the community's WI and displays inhabited areas at risk, forest areas that contain critical human infrastructure, as well as forest areas at risk for large-scale fire disturbance. The final product would also include a community risk assessment that considers each analysis of the fuel hazards, risk of wildfire occurrence, homes, businesses, and essential infrastructure at risk, and other community values at risk, and local preparedness capability. With these results, I also intend to provide a detailed explanation of my methodology for this assessment to the planners of the county so they can be used quickly to reassess current risks as the WUI and the environment evolves in the future. So for my project timeline, I intend to have all of my analysis for this project completed by early July. The emergency management team for Fremont County wants to publish their updated CWPP by the end of September. So I'm planning on having my final build of the products sent over to their office for presentation by the end of August. So just looking at possible presentation values that would be great for this type of a project. I'm considering 2 venues to present these results. The first venue I'm considering is at the Colorado Wildland Fire Conference that's coming up in September in Grand Junction. From what I can gather about the conference, it is the Mecca gathering of all wildfire planners in Colorado. The published theme for this year's conference will be Resilient Colorado, moving forward and evolving wildfire landscapes, which is right up the alley, and right up my alley, and a perfect theme to present the evolving role of GIS and identifying risk, especially within the WI. I also plan to present these results to the Fremont County's Planning Committee as they finalize their CWPP this summer. Here's just a quick comprehensive list of the references that I've been using to guide my analysis. Most of what it lists here is focused around studies that provided different ways to categorize risk, along with a couple of good studies that discuss fuel models and wildfire behavior conditions. All right, I'd like to take a final moment to just thank Dr. Kroll at the Fremont County Emergency Management Office for opening up his team and very quickly to me and just basically laying out all his resources to me for this project. He's made the first half of this project pretty seamless and has helped me set this project up for success in the future. I'd also like to take a minute to recognize my advisor, Dr. Alan Taylor, for his invaluable guidance and has kept me on the right path as this initial concept has morphed through the last few months. Again, so that's it for my proposal. Thanks again for joining me today, and I will now open it up for any questions or comments.
All right, Andrew, thanks. Great job. Looks like you might have a question popping up in the chat window now.
Okay. So the question I got here is it says, congratulations on the interesting and important work. Can you envision a means to validate your results? So the one way I intend to validate my results is to look at, like I mentioned in my project, as far as to look at like historic fire behavior and in the county and in relation to where the WI, and to see if that fire behavior operates in the same risk or burns in the same way that would be predicted in the wildfire risk model that I'll build. So that's the way I was planning to try to validate my results.
I have a question. So I've been to Canyon City and Florence and Cripple Creek and all those good places there. One interesting aspect of especially Cripple Creek is the fact that it has a huge number of casinos. How does the landscape or the variation in landscape across the county influence your approach?
So if you look at it, so Cripple Creek is actually up in Teller County, is north of the study area that I'm looking at. But so Cripple Creek is in the middle of the Front Range and the shadow of Pikes Peak, and so the elevation and the type of forest is a lot different in the northern half of Fremont County. That is similar to what's in that it's in the northern half of Fremont County, but then it changes as you go further south to more of a dry, arid plain in the central portions of Fremont County, and then as you get to the San Francisco Mountains in the south, it goes back to a heavy, mountainous, wooded terrain. So, that as you kind of allude to there, there's definitely a huge difference in wildfire behavior, according to how the topography lays out and how the wind exhibits behaviors throughout that terrain. And so I anticipate a lot of varying results between basically the population centers, which is in the center of the county, and the more gentle terrain than what is exhibited in the northern portion of the county and the southern portion of the county.
All right, thanks for your answer. Anyone else have any questions for Andrew? Okay, here we have another one, another question pop up.
Hey, I got another one here. It says, have you done a great job identifying a meaningful topic and listing collaborators and stakeholders? It's exciting that your methodology and findings may be so valued. So that's a good comment, but not really a question. So I appreciate the comment.
All right, well, seeing as we don't have any more questions, I'd like to draw this session to a conclusion. So thanks to Christopher and Andrew for their great presentations. Best of luck to you on your capstone progress. And we'll see everyone again tomorrow. Another round of talks for 596B.